So let's talk about a critical issue. One of my favorite topics when it comes to early stage companies like yours, and that is, who is the best first hire for me? Who should I bring on board after the founder? Yeah, maybe you have already done that, and great, congratulations. But usually that's what companies get wrong. Talking from personal experience, I myself have gotten it wrong with previous companies that I launched, and that I brought somebody on board after me leading sales that was way too experienced, way too mature, that couldn't cope with the velocity, the speed, and the experimentation that we still had in the sales team. Just with the effect that I lost salespeople over it, that sales plummeted, went down, pipeline went empty, and we burned through 2 or 3 head of sales profiles before I found the right one. So the right kind of head of sales is a different question, but who is the first hire? And one thing is important for you to keep in mind. Since you're so early on in the process, most of you haven't really nailed message market fit, some maybe not even product market fit. Things change drastically, weekly. Your product changes, you may pivot. You need to experiment with ICPs that you maybe want to shift in between. So here, what you need is somebody that is flexible enough in their mind, that is fast enough, smart enough, that can listen well, that can experiment, that can make the right assumptions, that can deduce the right consequences and learnings for you. And then write it down, replicate it, and then maybe hire the first operational salespeople. So your first one is more like a MacGyver, if you want to think of that, if you still know that. So it's somebody, I say, that excels at discovery and speed rather than execution and structure. You're not at execution and structure yet, probably. But usually, great experience made with what we call entrepreneurs in residence. So relatively younger people that are hungry to learn, that are coachable, that are smart, maybe come out of university, or have had their first jobs behind them, or relevant internships, maybe consulting background. So somebody that is has been like an associate before somewhere else. So those are the kind of profiles that you want to look for the very first hire. Yeah, it's just a rule of thumb, but important. Whoever excels at discovery and speed is usually somebody that's good at first hire. Then once you've done that, and you have validated all that, you've come up with a sales playbook, and you're building a sales team, what to go after. And you may remember the video from Jocko that we had in the introduction to sales. There are parts that you usually talk about in tech sales. So different models. One is called an SDR-AE model, and one is just sales, meaning you have one person covering full cycle, everything from lead acquisition, appointment setting to closing. What is the right setup? And that, in short, it depends. It really depends from sales cycle to sales cycle, company and industry to industry. But let's go through the different types. Again, if you have one SDR, BDR, that is, let's say, supplying 2 account executives with business, with appointments, that is usually the case when you're very inbound heavy. So here, one SDR, BDR, usually you call that an SDR. BDR is usually called outbound, SDR is inbound, just to get the terminology right, but people use it interchangeably. You have one SDR, it's getting so much inbound that they can set appointments for 2 AEs. Yeah. Here, I think AEs should still always also do some hunting, some pipeline building, right? But they're heavily provided by an SDR. If you have a split of 2, usually BDRs to 1 AE, is when you're very outbound heavy, very outbound reliant. Then you need, since outbound is heavier, you don't get enough meetings, you don't get the meeting velocity than with inbound heavy businesses. You sometimes need 2 BDRs to really have 1 AE busy to fill the pipeline, to convert these to opportunities, demos, and then deals. And if you're pretty equal or balanced, meaning you get a mix of inbound and outbound. You may have a split from 1-to-1. You may have, for example, one BDR supplying an AE, or you may have one BDR for one AE and an inbound SDR supplying another AE. That depends. Yeah, but that's a very balanced approach. Then you have the one that we call full cycle, where you don't have an SDR or BDR, but you have a sales manager, usually somebody that's a bit more experienced, that manages the pipeline in full. Yeah? So important is, in considering a setup, that your customer acquisition costs for your pod, for your team, shouldn't again be more than 40% of your total AR that the team brings in, or your total revenue, if you don't work with ARRs. So customer acquisition costs shouldn't be more than 40%, meaning your team setup needs to account to that formula. And then, what is best, SDR, AE, or full cycle? Especially last year with the crisis of the wars, and there's a huge drive for efficiency. Some teams go back to a full cycle model, and one of the reasons is that an SDR, AE model is relatively expensive. Okay, think about it. You have an SDR that you need to bring on board. You have an AE that you need to bring on board. Each have a tool stack relevant for them. So you really, let me actually make myself a bit smaller here. You need to make sure that they bring enough business in to justify that expense. And also, the handoff creates friction, meaning the handoff between SDR, AE, and you see it especially with American companies, US companies, or UK companies that live that model highly, especially when you have sales engagement tools or sales tools. You see you book a demo sometimes, or you reach out to somebody, or they reach out to you in SDR, they set a meeting, immediately next day an AE takes over. And sometimes when not done right, they ask you the same set of questions. They don't create value for you. It's not a better expert that provides more value as justified as it should be. It's just another person asking you the same questions. And it doesn't feel good for customer experience perspectives, and you lose trust. But it's great if you need to build a bigger pipeline faster, because it makes sense. You just have one person focusing on top of the funnel, bringing in opportunities, the other on converting them. You have a continuous pipeline because both work what they are best at. And you don't have a fluctuating pipeline that you very often see in other companies. And you can train them. Everyone can become an expert in their skills area, which makes sense, right? If you want to get a knee surgery, you go to a knee expert. Or if you get brain surgery, you go to experts in that, not somebody who's doing everything. So you build rockstars for both more easily. The AE, or the full cycle model, has the big advantage. There's no handoff needed. Great for customer experience, right? They have one point of contact, and that accompanies them from first meeting to closing. And that also creates less complexity. Yeah, there's no handoffs. There's no maybe specialized tools that you need for both. They still need tools, but maybe not to that degree. Yeah. And it's just easier to manage. Also from a headcount perspective, easier to manage. However, very often we see that, of course, when you work full cycle, that person is drawn towards deals that are close to closing, because that's where the most fun is. Reach out cold to prospects. Cold calling is difficult. And very often you need to go out of your comfort zone. And if you have easier deals to turn to, aka the ones that are closer to closing, reps don't do it. And that's when you see high pipeline, some closings, pipeline empty. And that's why especially high growth companies always turn to that model, because they need the velocity, the continuous pipeline. And again, there's no right or wrong. Generally, they're just guidelines when to use these models. The SDI model makes sense if you have a 10K ACV, so deals that are worth more than 10K and enough of them. Again, that model not being more than 40% of acquisition costs. And that's the rule of thumb, right? If you have a 1K ACV, so they say €100 monthly subscriptions, that model is probably too expensive, or putting it differently, deals that have a 1K or 2K ACV close within maybe a week. You don't need to you don't need to do a handoff from an SDR to an AE in that sense. That one person can just immediately close it. And then you don't have the fluctuating pipeline, because they call him, maybe they close him on the second or third call or meeting. Next one comes up. They're constantly building the pipeline. So for smaller ACVs, sometimes it can be lower than 5K. Yeah, so that's just a rule of thumb. I would use full cycle, because the velocity is so high that you don't have the fluctuating pipeline, and handoffs don't make sense. Or if you have few but very large deals, if you have 5, 6, 7, 8 deals, long cycles, very small total addressable market, so maybe just 50, 60, 70 companies a year, maybe you want to have experts that reach out to those companies and that can do it on their own. They don't need the velocity, the pipeline building from an SDR. That's then also relatively junior, that might burn, and the very few customers that you have to reach out to. Okay, so few but very large deals. I would also go for one expert full cycle seller. So that's just a rule of thumb for you, okay, to consider. And lastly, because that's usually something that's very interesting, because we have a recruiting business as well, here's some salary ranges for you to consider in knowing how long they stay within the role. That an SDR BDR usually has 10 to 18 months, no longer, because the role is difficult, right? It's tiring. And then they become an AE, senior AE, and a manager. For an SDR, calculate 50K OTE, usually in the DACH region. Italy, Spain is a bit lower than that. France is about the same as Germany, UK a bit more. Just for you to know what to plan with in full cycle sellers, usually varying by experience. Probably between 60 to 80K, really, even starting with slight variances by country. Hope that helps.